I said the joke and watched it explode into the bus like something tossed in too close to the crowd, and the sound was big and quick and stupid. I laughed with them because you laugh when everyone laughs, but my laugh died when I saw Mark go white and pack up like I'd thrown a brick. I could feel the room change in a second, like someone flipped a switch and all the lights went to a different color, and I knew somewhere under the noise something had broken. Hannah started wailing from the back and it cut through the chatter like a siren. Claire leaned in and hissed into her ear something sharp. Hannah folded into herself and the sobs got louder, so loud I could hear everything but not one thing. The bus driver wiped his face in the rearview at a red light like he'd seen a ghost, and I noticed my phone buzzing with 3 missed calls from Dad. No signal. The little icon at the top of my screen showed nothing. I felt my stomach drop and tried to stand to go after Mark, but Ms. Prescott's voice came down like a gavel. "Sit down," she said, voice dry and final, and I sat like someone stopped a knife with their voice. It wasn't bossy in that schoolteacher way, it was cold, clipped, a protection she gave herself more than anyone else. That silence after her order pressed into me like a premonition I couldn't read. I wanted to chase Mark to say, "Dude, seriously, what the hell?" But I stayed in my seat with my hands on my knees and watched him move 3 rows forward. He didn't look back once. People laughed more, trying to fill the gap with noise, but the jokes around me felt thin. Sid slapped my shoulder as if to make me feel normal. "Good one, man," he said, but his eyes weren't laughing. He kept glancing at Mark in a way that made me feel like I'd been caught doing something I couldn't fix. Ryan nudged me and mouthed, "Kara," like this was still a game, like someone could still flirt over an elephant in the room. I pulled up my lock screen, Mir and me, dumb grins, and he took a step back like someone who'd been told not to touch a hot stove. "You okay?" I asked Ryan, but he just shrugged and moved away like whatever had happened was contagious. The bus hummed along and I forced myself to play a stupid game on my phone, thumbing at pixels while my mind ran the scene in loops. Mark's face kept flashing in my head, gray, empty, and it felt wrong that I'd made the joke 2 seconds before sensing the world tip. I kept thinking about the 3 missed calls and how Dad never called like that unless something real was on fire. At the next stop, I stood up to get off and talk to Mark anyway, because you can't leave someone walking around with the wind knocked out of them. Ms. Prescott's eyes clipped mine from the front and she barked, "Sit." It wasn't rude, it was strict, and it shut me down harder than any kid in the back could. I sat. Mark folded his head in his hands and typed on his phone like he was burning a letter no one could read. I mouthed, "Tell me," and he looked up like he'd been slapped. "I can't not hear." He said it like it was a wound. I tried to laugh it off because that's what people do, you ease things with humor when you don't know how to fix them. "Come on, man, it was a joke," I said loud enough for a few people to hear. He stood up and grabbed his bag like he was leaving the bus forever. "I need space," he snapped without looking at me. He moved 3 rows forward and sat like he'd put a wall between us. I reached for him anyway, because you reach for your friends when they close up. But Ms. Prescott's hand on my shoulder held me down and said words I couldn't argue with. The bus pulled away and the laughter fell off like it had been set on a cliff. I kept looking back at Mark's hunched frame while the countryside slid by and the phone kept buzzing with missed calls that couldn't get through. I felt a cold knot form in my gut and I couldn't shake the idea that something bigger was happening, and I just shouted a stupid line right into the middle of it. The trip had turned into a thing I didn't understand, and every time the bus hit a bump I felt like the world wanted to tell me a secret and I wasn't allowed to hear it. I caught up with Mark at the bleachers and he recoiled like I'd thrown a punch, folding into himself until he was small and muttering into his phone. "Hey man, what's going on?" I said, trying to keep it normal so he wouldn't snap. He blinked and looked at me like I was a stranger. "I can't talk here," he said, voice tight, and then he shut his phone and stared at the ground like someone who'd swallowed a bad truth and couldn't spit it out. Sid pulled me away like a teammate who'd seen the game change and needed to get me out of the noise. He pressed his hand into my shoulder, hard, steady, like he was offering something to hold onto, and he said, "If you need me, I'm here." His voice was soft, but it didn't fix the way my chest kept tightening. "Thanks," I told him, because that's what friends do. They stand there with you even when standing doesn't help. Sid left after that, giving me a look that said he wanted to help more than he could. At water break, Ryan barreled up like he needed to unload gossip faster than he could catch his breath. "Kara's single now," he blurted, grinning like he'd hit the jackpot and wanted to make sure I knew. He hadn't seen my face yet. When I turned my phone so he could see Mia smiling on my lock screen, Ryan went pale and backed away like someone who'd bitten into something rotten. "Oh," was all he said, and then he shuffled off like the news had something to do with him. I tried to call Mia on the landline in the field house and kept dialing until my fingers cramped and my voice got hoarse, but it went straight to voicemail every time. "Mia, hey, it's me," I said into the handset more times than I can count, leaving messages that felt like I was talking to a ghost. "Call me back when you can." No ring, no buzz, nothing. The silence from her end pressed down on me until I wanted to scream into the phone and shatter something. By lunch, the whispers had multiplied like mold. People circled with opinions and pity, and the looks dripped around me like rain. Ava found Mark and slapped him hard for hiding things from everyone, her face red with something fierce and raw. "How could you keep that from him?" she shouted at him, hands shaking. He didn't fight back. He stood there like the world had emptied his mouth of words and left him with only skin and silence. Hannah came up behind me and screamed that I didn't deserve Mia, her voice raw and full of hurt that pierced me more than anything. "You never deserved her," she spat, and whoever was beside her held her back as she kept pacing and ranting. Claire tried to calm her, whispering under her breath like she was cleaning a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. People took sides quick, like this was a game and you picked a team and that settled it. The coaches were arguing by the vending machines, voices low but sharp like knives. Ms. Griffin hissed, "He has a right to know," and Ms. Prescott shot back, "No point, the decision's been made." They sounded like grown-ups covering up a mess with words they hoped would hold. I walked up to them, chest tight, and demanded answers. "What decision? What's happening?" I felt like I'd thrown a grenade and everyone was ducking for cover. They scattered like I'd said something dangerous, a version like they were afraid the truth might stick to them. Ms. Prescott wouldn't meet my eyes, and Ms. Griffin kept polishing a coin of sympathy but wouldn't give me facts. I paced and asked again, louder this time, and kids around us slotted into silence like traffic parting around a crash. Some looked away. Others watched me like I was the only thing moving in a painting that had been frozen. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket again, more missed calls from Dad, and I shoved it back in like it was an infection. People kept talking in low circles, filling empty spaces with rumors and fragments. I wanted to corner someone and force facts out of them to make it stop spinning in my head, but when I pushed, they backed away like I was contagious. The whole day felt like a pressure cooker where whispers were steam and my chest was the lid about to pop. By the time lunch bell rang, the bus trip faded into memory, and the real thing was here in the fieldhouse. A raw blur of guilt, anger, and confusion that no joke could fix. I kept replaying my line about moms and girlfriends like a stone dropped into still water, watching the ripples spread out farther than I wanted, while everyone who mattered was spending the day rearranging the pieces and leaving me standing in the center asking, why, and getting nothing back but looks. Mark cried on the bus like I'd never seen him cry before, big ugly sobs that shook his whole body and made me feel small for not seeing it sooner. He kept saying between gasps, "Nobody's dead, okay? Nobody's dead." He sounded so desperate that I let myself believe him because believing felt like a coat I could wrap around myself and keep warm. I was tired and empty, and the easiest thing was to go back to my game and let the colors on the screen drown the noise that kept building behind my teeth. I played until my thumbs cramped and the bus rolled up to the hospital, lights bleeding into the windows like someone had cracked the world open. Even then I tried to brace for whatever was coming with a sort of stupid hope, because believing the bad news wasn't true made it feel less likely. We got off and the first thing I saw was Mia's family in black, standing like a wall at the curb. Her mother saw me and moved like she'd been pulled by a string, all the breath gone out of her. She lunged and started screaming that I had chosen my mom, that I'd picked my mother to live. Her voice was raw and loud, and it hit me like a physical thing. Dad's hand wrapped around my arm like iron, and he dragged me into the hospital with a speed that left me stumbling. He didn't say much in the car except, "We need to know," over and over, like a mantra that tried to make sense of the panic in his chest. In the ICU, the fluorescent lights were sharp, and the beeps of machines were steady in a way that felt like a verdict. My mother lay there pale and quiet, and her face was small under the hospital sheets. Tubes ran to her like ropes, and I could feel every sound in my body like it was trying to translate what the machines were saying. A doctor stepped over with clipped professional words, the kind people use when they've practiced pain so often it becomes routine. "There was a head-on collision," he said flatly, like reading from notes. "A drunk driver, they prioritized care triage. Only one person could be saved, we did what we could." It landed in my chest like a fist. I felt the room tilt and the air go thin, like someone had turned off the lights on my stomach. I kept looking from the doctor to my mother to the machines, trying to stitch the facts together with the joke I'd told hours before and the way Mark had gone still. Dad's voice was different when he turned to me, cracked and cold at the same time. "You made your choice on that bus," he said, and the words were loud in the ICU like they had been in a courtroom. His fingers dug into my shoulder and I felt every ounce of him pushing blame outwards to stop himself falling apart. "Everyone heard you say moms before everything," he said, as if my stupid line had been some kind of verdict that decided who lived and who died. The accusation shoved air out of me and made the machine's beeps feel like they were accusing me too. I wanted to scream that a joke isn't a law and words don't steer cars, but my voice wouldn't work, so I said nothing. Instead, I stood there like someone who had been dragged into a play with no lines. People in the room moved with a businesslike calm, nurses adjusting IVs, a surgeon's notes folded and passed, while inside me everything was messy and hot and unfair. I looked down at my hands and they were shaking, and the world seemed to be made of glass I could no longer read through. Mia's mother kept pointing at me like I was the thing that had turned her life inside out. She trusted you, she screamed at me again and again, and her father held her back because he was smaller than the grief and needed someone to stand up so he could sink. I told myself that the truth was more complicated, that drunk driving and choices by other people had a lot to do with what happened, but the honest words felt thin and brittle compared to the weight of the accusation. A nurse, Melissa, came and put her hand on my shoulder in a way that didn't try to fix anything, just to keep me steady. A security guard named Tyler stayed nearby, quiet and steady, like he'd seen worse and was holding the line so the rest of us didn't fall over it. I whispered into the beeping room because the machines didn't argue back. "I'm sorry," I said, the same way a man says sorry when he's out of answers. Somehow the apology didn't feel like enough, but it was all I had that fit in my hands without falling apart. The nights after that blurred into a long gray thing that didn't have edges, and I slept in small snatches between the hospital chair and the floor like I was trying to hide from the whole world. Nurses with easy names, Melissa came by with warm coffee and a way of saying, "You're doing okay," that sounded like a permission slip. Tyler, the security guard, would stand at the door and ask if I needed anything, and his quiet voice felt like someone holding a flashlight in a dark room. They didn't try to explain what happened. They just offered small comforts that kept me from falling apart in public. Uncle Aaron showed up like a storm in a soft place, both smelling like jet fuel in the airport. He hugged me so hard I could feel the bones in my back, and he sat down and told me something so ordinary it made my chest give way. Mia had been heading to my house to bring back my lucky pen. She wanted to drop it off, said you'd left it last week, he said like this was a small errand, and my hands went cold. The picture of her driving to do something that tiny and sweet made my stomach twist. It turned the chaos into a story with a name and a face. I kept replaying that image over and over. I imagined Mia smiling in the car, singing along to a song, holding my stupid pen like a talisman. I thought about the pen on my desk now in the back of my mind like a silent witness, and felt a new kind of guilt that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with timing. Aaron told me he'd talked to Blake, and Blake's messages were short and careful. "She always liked that stupid pen," Aaron muttered, giving me more to carry. Dad and I talked in low, broken sentences later, when the hospital had emptied into night and the machines were louder without people talking over them. He finally told me why he'd pushed the story about my choice, why he'd lied to Mia's parents. Randomness was too terrifying, he said, voice raw, and then he said, I needed something to blame. He admitted making a story up because a life where bad things happen for no reason felt worse than inventing a reason that let him point to someone. Hearing him say it made something inside me unclench and then tighten again. I wanted to throw things at him and hug him at the same time. School after that felt like walking into a courtroom every morning. Hallways were lined with people who watched me like they were waiting for the verdict. Faces turned when I passed, whispers followed me like a rain that wouldn't stop, and even classes felt like interrogations. I would open my locker and feel dozens of eyes on me while someone behind a poster kept the rumor mill spinning. It was small town theater, and I had the lead role in a play I never auditioned for. Stacy one day managed a scream that cut the hall like someone breaking glass. "You killed her," she shouted, and teachers had to pull her back because the words were violent enough to make other kids cry. The principal tried to step in with a calm voice and said, "This is a serious time, we have protocols to prevent more trauma." But those words came out like a script someone handed him 2 minutes before, and they did nothing for the person being screamed at. Silence from the adults felt worse than the truth, because silence let whispers grow into monsters. Teachers tried to mediate with lines they must have read in a staff handbook. Ms. Griffin would say things like, "We need to be careful around this," and Mr. Haynes would suggest counseling resources. Their soft-sounding protocols were meant to keep anyone else from breaking, but to me they sounded like code for "don't talk about it," which felt worse than having a harsh truth thrown at my face. It was like the whole school had been told to tiptoe around a live wire, and I was stuck in the middle of the room. Some kids offered support in their own clumsy ways. Sid sat with me at lunch and pushed a sandwich across the table without saying much. Corey kept legal stuff organized. He was the one who reminded me to answer calls from lawyers and to keep receipts. Little acts of care became lifelines, but the big picture still felt like a jagged hole. I tried peer counseling and thought about what to say without sounding defensive. I found that when I spoke honestly, a few people listened. That gave me a place to stand. At night, I would sit in the dark and think about the pen and the way Dad pinned blame to slow his own fall. I kept telling myself some things clearly. Jax Watkins was the one who made the decision to drink and drive, and Mia had been doing something kind for me. Those facts didn't take away the pain, but clinging to them helped me stop accepting someone else's story as truth. Little by little, the noises in the hall dulled, and the world didn't feel quite so designed to accuse me. Alina Gray sat with me in a small, quiet room and told me straight that rumors don't equal facts and that I had to separate what people were saying from what actually happened. She had a way of asking questions that made me say things out loud I'd been carrying silently, like, "What did you see? And who told you that?" I found myself saying the bus joke and Mark going pale, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she wrote notes and told me, "You need the map of truth before you can walk out of this maze." And that sentence stuck in my head like a signpost. The DA, Hadley Pierce, called me in and laid everything out on a table like pieces of a puzzle she was finally willing to let me see. She showed me Watkins's record, 2 prior DUIs, a breathalyzer at .24 the night of the crash, suspensions, and a violent history that didn't belong on the road. When she said the number out loud, it sounded criminal and cold, like the driver had treated lives like a game. "This man has shown a clear pattern," she said, flipping through papers, "and we'll make sure the facts are what people remember, not the gossip." That felt like relief and a new kind of anger that was sharp and focused. The town started to lean into the courtroom instead of gossip. People liked having a person to blame because blame is easier than messy truth, and Watkins fit the template. It meant my anger had a place to go, straight at the man who got behind the wheel drunk instead of at the complicated tangle of adults and mistakes. The legal work was loud in its own way. Subpoenas, discovery, police reports stacked in manila folders like the world was finally doing its job. Hadley's confidence felt like an armor I could borrow, if only for courtroom days. I drove out to the cemetery with purple flowers Mia loved, and I sat on the edge of her plot and told her everything in a voice that kept cracking. "I told that stupid joke on the bus," I said aloud, and Mark went quiet, and then the world changed. I cried until my throat hurt and the story came out in ragged pieces. I said how I'd called the landline until my fingers cramped, how Dad had lied, and how people had whispered like vultures. Telling it to her felt like unloading a bag I'd carried too long. The groundskeeper passed and nodded like he'd heard heavier things. He didn't interrupt. After the cemetery, Mark came up to me and handed over a folded stack of paper, 10 pages, dense with handwriting, and he looked like a man who'd been dragged behind his own shame. "I'm sorry," he said, voice thin, and didn't try to dress it up. The letter was everything he hadn't said on the bus. How he'd been told to keep quiet, how angry and scared he'd been, and how the secret had eaten him into someone he barely recognized. He'd written about feeling responsible, and about how he'd watched the rumor grow and felt powerless. Reading the letter in the parking lot felt like being handed a key to a door I'd been staring at for weeks. It didn't fix the rawness or the missing person at the center, and it didn't change the machine of grief, but it cracked something inside both of us. The 10 pages were a kind of admission, and my anger at him softened into something like understanding. I told him quietly, "You should have told me," and he cried harder. "I know," he said. Those 2 words were small, but they shifted the distance between us. The letter gave me something I could hold on to as the legal case moved forward. Hadley used facts, Watkins's record, witness testimony, and physical evidence to keep the story from getting rewritten by rumor. The courthouse felt different when I sat in it, with documents and names that matched the truth instead of whispers. People still looked at me in halls, and some still said cruel things, but the public focus on Watkins started to calm the weather around me, like a storm finally naming itself and moving on. Alina kept working with me to separate feelings from facts so I wouldn't drown in untrue stories. Her voice was patient and steady when mine shook, and she made room for my guilt without turning it into a sentence. Mark and I didn't go back to how things were, but the letter opened a tiny door in the wall between us. Little by little, that crack grew into a path we could walk without falling apart every time our names came up. The legal fight would still be hard, but having the truth lined up in paper, and people who would say it out loud, made the days a little less chaotic and a bit more bearable. The weeks after the crash turned into a blur of courtrooms, lawyer meetings, and insurance calls until the days all started to look the same, and I learned to breathe through them. I sat in waiting rooms with my hands folded and watched lawyers trade papers like they were playing a slow game of chess. The defense tried every angle they could, nudging blame around like it was a hot potato, and the DA, Hadley Pierce, pushed back hard every time. She laid out Watkins's record like a trail of bad decisions that led right to that night, and her voice made the facts impossible to pretend away. At first, the defense kept pulling on threads, seatbelts, speed, other small details, anything to make the blame stretch thinner. It felt like they were trying to split a single ugly truth into a dozen smaller ones so people wouldn't look properly at the person who chose to drink and drive. Hadley would stand up and say, "This is not about what we wish had happened. This is about what happened." And she'd point to Watkins's prior DUIs and that .24 reading like a hammer. Watching her work made something in me stop spinning for a minute. It gave me something solid to stand on. We went through preliminary hearings where witnesses spoke, cops read reports, and the court filled with people who wanted a name to stick to. I sat in the gallery and listened with my hands clamped so tight my palms hurt. The legal machinery is weirdly calm when it's doing its terrible work. Papers rustle, objections get shouted, and a judge bangs a gavel like a metronome for grief. It was all very official and very cold, and somehow that felt like a blessing because it kept the focus away from gossip and on facts. Then Watkins made the choice to plead guilty rather than go to trial. I remember the DA telling me like it was a step on a mountain we'd climbed, and a weight dropped off my chest because it meant we didn't have to sit through a whole public trial tearing open everything again. The judge listened, nodded, and then read the sentence: 15 years, no parole. When the words came down in that dull, final way, my stomach sank and I felt something open inside me that had been tight as a fist. The day I read my victim impact statement in court, my legs shook so badly I thought I couldn't stand. I had practiced the lines with Alina until my voice didn't wobble on the phone, but when it mattered, my body betrayed me. I walked to the podium and looked at Mia's parents sitting there in the front row, faces hollow and raw, and the words came out like I'd been carrying them in my chest for months. She was kind, I said, my voice cracking. She was bringing back my pen. She was alive for small things. And she's gone. I talked about the joke on the bus, the silence that followed, the rumors, and the way adults lied to steady themselves. I said I felt guilty for things I hadn't done, but I also said I wanted the world to know who really made that decision that night. After the hearing, Mia's father pulled me aside. He looked older than his years and the grief had hollowed him out. He told me quietly that they were moving away to try to start over and that the move was a last, messy attempt at peace. Then he said something I hadn't dared hope for: "We don't blame you anymore." Those words hit me like a cool hand on a fevered forehead. I didn't know how to respond at first, except to tell him thank you, and he gave me a look that said little and meant everything. Mercy showed up in a tiny, unexpected way, and it felt like an answer I didn't know I wanted. Back home, Mom's recovery moved in small steps that counted like miracles. She squeezed my hand once during a reflex test, and it felt like finding a small island in a storm. Another day, she opened an eye a centimeter more than the day before, and a therapist said, "That's progress with a careful kind of hope." Victoria, the physical therapist, kept reminding us that healing doesn't run on a clock. Tiny wins add up, she'd say, and we pinned ourselves to those words like they were beacons. Some nights I'd sit by Mom's bed and play her favorite song until some part of her face relaxed. A week after the sentence, she managed a half smile when I told a stupid joke that used to make her groan. Those little moments were whole islands of relief. Dad started going to AA meetings and showed up to them with the same stubbornness he'd shown in other parts of life, and he took the small wins like trophies: 30 days, 60 days. He was trying, and that mattered more than anything. The legal part closed in one sense. The sentence was handed down and the city's paperwork moved on, but the real work was only beginning. I kept going to therapy with Alina, doing the hard thing of putting truth next to feelings, and I spent afternoons in PT waiting rooms watching my mother relearn steps. Those tiny signs, fingers squeezing, a cautious smile, a therapist's hopeful nod, kept me anchored in a world that had once felt like it would swallow me whole. They weren't wholesale fixes, but they were proof that life could keep moving forward, even when the hurt stayed with you. Corey took over the stuff Dad could no longer hold down, and I watched him move through spreadsheets and calls like it was nothing new, even though it felt huge to me. He handled insurance calls, car paperwork, and appointments with a quiet focus that kept the house from tipping under all the things adults suddenly needed done. I paid him back by doing small stuff, making coffee, folding towels, running to the pharmacy, because watching him carry that load without complaining felt like a gift I couldn't waste. Dad started going to AA meetings, and he went more often than not, which was the first real proof I'd seen that he wanted to change for more than a week at a time. He came home smelling like coffee in church basements and would tell me about speakers who'd said things that landed like rocks in his head. I heard him say day by day enough times that it stopped sounding like a slogan and started to sound like a plan he actually believed in. He mended in small stitches, apologies that were real, quiet mornings where he'd make the bed, staying for Mom's therapy sessions. It wasn't perfect, but it was different in the best way. The house changed around us because Mom needed things to be safer and within reach, and we learned to live with it even though it felt like admitting a new normal. We put up grab bars in the bathroom that looked like hospital fixtures but saved her when she lost balance. A ramp went across the front steps so her wheelchair didn't need to be manhandled every time she wanted to go outside. We rented a hospital bed and put it in the living room where we could see her better and talk across the room without straining. It made our home look like a recovery center, but it also made Mom more part of the day again. I started peer counseling training at school because Alina pushed me to take something useful and make it belong to someone else. The training was practical: how to listen, how to ask the right questions, where to send someone if they needed more help, and it felt weird at first to sit in a circle and talk about feelings. Then they put me in a room with a kid who'd lost his dad and another who'd been in an accident, and I sat and listened. I learned how to ask the small, safe questions that let people breathe. And I learned that sitting quietly with someone in pain is often the only medicine they need for a few minutes. Helping younger kids taught me how to lighten my own load, because when you teach someone else how to survive a day, you see your own survival as possible too. I'd show a freshman how to name the hard feelings and where to go on campus when things felt heavy, and seeing them leave a little steadier made me feel like I had room in my chest again. Counseling wasn't a cure, but it was a purpose. It gave my hands a job besides holding a phone or a sheet of paper. Now they were there to take a younger kid's and remind them they weren't alone. Jason and I never got back to how we were before everything went wrong. That gap opened and we carried different kinds of scars. We could sit in the same room now without the old scenes repeating like a bad loop, which counted for something even if it wasn't friendship as it had been. Sometimes we'd trade a joke that landed and both of us would laugh 3 seconds late, like people who remembered how to feel something new. That quiet truce mattered because it meant we could survive being near each other. Blake's texts were small at first, made dinner, and dad mode today, and then they became regular updates about how Mia's parents were doing. The messages were simple and human, small stitches sewing a life back together in a town that had nearly unraveled. When he texted that his mom had smiled at a photo of Mia and told a tiny joke, I felt relieved in a new kind of way. Those mundane updates made grief feel less all-consuming and more like something that could be lived around instead of inside. Mom made me promise to stop carrying the blame that other people had invented, and she said it through tears like it mattered more than most things she could ask. "You're my son," she told me, voice soft and fierce at once, "and I need you to stop hurting like this for things that aren't yours." She cried for me in a way that broke the last of the pride I'd wrapped around myself. The tears were not about pity, but about giving me permission to let go. It was the kind of forgiveness that makes you breathe easier, because it tells you don't have to carry everything alone. The days kept being small and ordinary in the best possible way: PT sessions, AA meetings, peer counseling shifts, and visits to Mia's grave that became calmer with time. I learned to fold grief into my daily routine instead of letting it run my life, and that made space for small mercies. A steady hand from Dad, a text from Blake that didn't hurt, and Mom's laugh when she got a tiny victory in therapy. Nothing erased what happened, but those little things kept me moving forward. Months stacked up like pages I had to turn whether I wanted to or not, each one a weird mix of grief and small, stubborn wins that felt like survival wearing normal clothes. I went to therapy with Alina, and sometimes we sat in a room while I said things that sounded like a stranger's story until they started feeling like mine to hold. Mom kept going to PT, and one day, when the therapist signaled that practice was enough, she walked unaided across a little stage the staff called a graduation. We all cried sloppy, messy tears, and it felt like a public apology from the world for letting her hurt so long. Dad hit sobriety milestones one by one, and his voice changed with each one until day by day wasn't just words he mouthed. It was the way the man at the kitchen table looked at the world. He started showing up to the small things, making coffee, folding laundry, joining Mom for light exercises, and those ordinary acts became a ledger of proof that he wasn't sliding back anymore. Corey kept the logistics steady like a quiet machine, and his presence made days less likely to tip into chaos. I started college nearby so I could keep my chair in the kitchen and still have a life that was mine, and the new classes felt like a bridge to somewhere I hadn't been allowed to step into before. On the anniversary, we went back to the cemetery together, not because it made the hurt smaller, but because names said out loud keep people from disappearing. We sat by Mia's grave and I put out the purple flowers she loved, the same color she'd picked for nothing important and everything meaningful. The town read names that day, one after another, and it was a strange comfort to hear community voices holding what we lost instead of letting it fester in gossip. Saying names didn't fix what was gone, but it made the absence into something people could carry with us instead of tripping over in secret. Loss didn't vanish. It rearranged how we moved through the day. Some mornings I still woke up and the first thought was a small dull ache like something heavy left on my chest, and I had to remind myself to breathe before getting out of bed. But the edges of my life softened in ways that let light in small things like Dad's laugh when he told a ridiculous story from AA, or Mom's face when she managed a full meal without needing help, or a text from Blake that said his dad finally laughed at a memory, and it landed like proof that grief could rust into something less sharp. We learned to hold grief beside little joys. Dinner was a ritual again. We ate together sometimes, trading small stories about the awful or funny bits of the day. Blake and I traded messages that weren't just about sorrow. He sent photos of his dog or a dumb meme, and it made me think of simple shared things that don't belong to tragedy. Mia's parents kept in touch in a careful human way, cards on holidays, and once in a while a handwritten note that would arrive when I least expected it. Those cards were like small compasses, pointing me back to the idea that people could be kind, without needing something from me. Peer counseling turned into more than a class. It became work that mattered in the small hours when someone showed up shaky and needed a voice that didn't judge. I sat with younger kids and learned how to ask the safe questions that helped them breathe. Helping them taught me how to breathe, too, how to name the pain and set it at the table without letting it eat the whole meal. It was slow and sometimes ugly, and it didn't make everything better, but it gave me a job that let grief exist without letting it run my life. There were days I still lurched awake replaying the bus and my stupid joke and how a stupid thing can echo out into something people use as proof of guilt. Those memories came and went like tides, and sometimes a wave hit hard. Other times the day would be full of small mercies. Mom finally moving without a walker, Dad celebrating 90 days clean, a semester passed without falling apart in class. Those moments piled up into a shelf of proof that life kept insisting on moving forward even when we wanted to stand still. Carrying on didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room. We made room for Mia in holidays and in quiet jokes and in a handful of traditions that felt like honoring instead of mourning. We learned that grief could sit beside joy on the couch and both could exist without stepping on the other's toes. That balance wasn't easy, but it was honest. One difficult, honest day at a time, we kept going.